Shabbat Shalom. It feels somewhat vicarious to be entering Shabbat here in this way with so much joy in Brooklyn tonight. The weather is beautiful. We're gearing up for no less than five B'nai Mitzvah tomorrow, as well as baby namings, a goodbye event for Shani tomorrow, and an epic Shavuot event just outside CBE on Sunday night. But as our clergy team gives our all to make these moments so meaningful, our attention is, as it often is, focused on Jerusalem. I barely need to explain why. You've seen the video clips of rockets fired into Israel and heard from loved ones who had to flee to bomb shelters. You've seen the buildings get flattened in Gaza. You've read the death tolls, seen footage of rubber bullets fired on worshipers at Al-Aqsa Mosque, a group of Jews attempting to lynch an Arab man in Bat Yam, an Arab mob beating a Jewish man nearly to death in Akko. For more than a week, I've consumed this news alongside a barrage of furious posts on social media from across the political spectrum. And as I've listened to so many friends and celebrities and Twitter personalities weigh in, I've been at a loss for my own words. I've known that I would need to address you all tonight, and yet I'm realizing that many of my old assumptions about the conflict and the old solutions to it that I believed in have been called into doubt. It seems time for something new that I don't yet know how to articulate. At the most basic level, I see the recent violence as the latest outcome of the ongoing Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands, with a status quo that works for Israelis on their side of a security barrier, but not one that works for Palestinians on either side of it. Unfortunately, unless we find new solutions or changes to the status quo, the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians will continue even after the current ferment subsides. Because the agreement more or less works for Israelis, while Palestinians remain oppressed. And every few years when there's an uprising like we see now, it must be viewed in the context of an imbalanced power structure between the two parties, where the weaker party, the Palestinians, is doing what it can to get free. The cycle will continue until the power structure shifts somehow. And hopefully when it does, it will mean that the security and dignity of all Palestinians can finally be bound up with the security and dignity of all Israelis. And as I speak to you, as I'm reading these words tonight, as I'm speaking with you, I'm realizing that behind me is a bookcase filled with books by Abba Eban and David Ben-Gurion. There is an El Al picture poster behind me and a figurine of Golda Meir on my desk. This is a hard thing for me to be saying with you all, and yet somehow it feels really true. And maybe you agree with that basic calculus that I presented, or maybe you don't. But we can all agree that the situation today is tragic. People are dying. Jews are being killed, and Palestinians are being killed in the name of Jewish security. As a Jew and as a human being, I am hurting, overcome by the tragedy of it all and overwhelmed with no end in sight. Perhaps even if you understand the causes of this conflict differently from how I do, you can relate to this overwhelm and this feeling of such sadness. The conflict between Israelis and Palestinians is not interminable. It seems like it will exist forever, and it's easy to become apathetic or jaded. But when we assume that Palestinians and Israelis will be at war forever, we allow the violence between them to persist. When we assume that Palestinians will always be adversarial toward Jews, or that Jewish Israelis cannot live side by side with Palestinians in the ancestral cities and towns of both peoples, we nihilistically accept this conflict. With these old assumptions, we lose the chance to work toward new solutions. And it seems as a rabbi, what is more useful than sharing my hot take on what's going on now in Israel is to remind us all not to rely on old assumptions. not to assume that we know for sure that new solutions are totally unworkable. There are plenty of solutions that many of us in the Zionist American Jewish establishment have not been willing to accept over the years. Solutions like conditioning American foreign aid to Israel on the dismantling of Jewish settlements, or even further, working toward building a binational state for Palestinians and Israelis to live together in a shared democracy, or a right of return for displaced Palestinians to dwell in their ancestral homes. These ideas, which many of us have assumed would never be practicable, which I have assumed would never work, must now make their way into our communal discourse around Israel. Because this conflict will not be solved by assuming the status quo is the only way forward. And as Zionism taught us, making assumptions about what the Jewish future will look like has always been a mistake. 100 years ago, no one could have imagined what would transpire for global Jewry in the century to follow. The Holocaust in Europe and the creation of a Jewish state paired with the extraordinary achievements of Jews in America have given us a global Jewish experience today that would be almost unrecognizable to our ancestors a century ago. Some may have had an inkling that history would take shape in this way, but no one could have imagined the radical changes, good and bad, that have totally transformed Jewish life today. And it was through surprising new ideas that Zionism emerged in the first place, as did the American Jewish community we know today. By remaining hopeful, a new Jewish world was born. Who are we then to assume that we know how the next 100 years will unfold for the Jewish people? Who are we to assume that we know what is possible or impossible in the coming years between Israelis and Palestinians, just because the last century has been so violent? It may be that we prefer a two-state solution to this conflict. But without that in the works, we need to challenge the predictions we have made that have led us to this moment of a stalled process toward peace. Jewish tradition beckons us to think twice before making predictions or assumptions about our future. We get a glimpse of this idea in the way our tradition treats something seemingly unrelated, the census. In this week's Parsha Bamidbar, God famously commands Moses to take a census of the Israelites, to count all adult Israelite males for future combat. But this sets up a dilemma in the broader canon of Jewish thought. If this Parsha includes a command to count the people, the Haftarah portion this week warns us against doing exactly that. The prophet Hosea explains, "The number of the people of Israel shall be like that of the sands of the sea, which cannot be measured or counted." The rabbis of the Talmud square this circle by saying that it is a sin to count Jews without explicit permission from God. They explain that when anyone other than God counts Jews, that person makes an assumption that that information will benefit them even if God does not convey it to them. It's an attempt to control the Jewish people's future and therefore an act of hubris. In the book of Samuel, King David takes a census of the Israelites for a military campaign that God does not command. And as a result of his arrogance, 70,000 Israelites die in a plague. The 14th century sage Gersonides explains that King David tries to hedge his bets by making a human calculation, but is punished for not trusting that God would surprise him by granting him something even better than what he could have imagined. God, in his words, is capable of offering salvation, independent of what the numbers seem to be, or how insecure human beings might feel. We could read this simply as a warning against counting Jews, but I think the lesson is really that no matter what we may assume, given the most accurate accounting, perhaps, whatever accounting numbers, statistics, or what we've already known to be true, we are not ultimately in control. Things can change, even when we are certain that we have data that proves the opposite. Our tradition would argue that no matter the numbers or facts that we assume to be accurate, ultimately God is in control. And when we act as if we know all the answers, still we may be missing something. I am tonight at a loss for exactly what will come next. But though I don't know precisely how we will reach a sustainable end to the conflict in Israel and Palestine, I want to be with you as we explore new alternatives, as we get comfortable with the discomfort of setting aside our old assumptions and we try on something new together. I still have endless hope that peace and justice is possible. And it is with that hope, that endless hope of 2,000 years and more, that we pray tonight. Adonai oz l'amo yiten. Adonai yivarech et amo v'shalom. Adonai will give strength to the people. Adonai will bless the people with peace. Shabbat shalom.